Did you know that since 2022, New York City has absorbed more than 170,000 migrants? And unlike other sanctuary cities, New York has a legal mandate known as a consent decree that requires the city to provide shelter to anyone who asks for it. Although New York City's sanctuary status can be seen as a positive thing by some, it has undeniably come with its host of problems, causing concern for many of its citizens. Well, as of 2024, changes are being made, and New York has officially started kicking migrants out. Today on Across the Globe, we will be discussing this and exploring the measures that have been put in place to finally tackle the migrant crisis in New York City. New York City's new migrant policy explained. As reported in January 2024, New York City welcomes up to 600 migrants a day who seek shelter. This number translated to almost 100,000 arriving in the city in 2023, and out of that number, around 60,000 were in the shelter system. When speaking about the matter in August 2023, Manhattan Borough President Mark Levine stated that caring for these migrants was costing the city roughly $10 million each day. According to Spectrum News, by October 2023, the city had spent more than $2 billion on the influx of asylum seekers coming into the city. They also stated how that number is expected to balloon to $12 billion over the next 3 years. So it is easy to see why changes have had to come into play. On May 22, 2024, NBC News reported that New York City has begun a new policy to evict some migrants from shelters within 30 days or 60 days for younger adults. The city and advocacy groups reached a settlement in March over the city's right to shelter, which mandates that the city offer refuge to anyone who enters, regardless of immigration status. This new policy is the outcome of that agreement. The Adams administration, mindful of the recent large-scale migration wave, looked for a means to curtail that right. Families with children who are migrants are exempt from the new restrictions and are able to reapply for placement in a shelter after a period of 60 days. As soon as the policy came into play, NBC reported that around 250 new arrivals would face eviction if they could not meet the city's list of requirements for extensions. This was then met with backlash from advocates who claimed the shift in policy was inhumane and unrealistic for migrants and would ultimately lead to homelessness. However, Mayor Eric Adams stood by his decision limiting the time migrants can stay in shelters at taxpayers' expense. The effects so far. According to the New York Times, the first wave of evictions affected adult migrants who were previously given 30-day notices before the policy came in. Within the first week, 250 migrants were affected. However, adults who wish to stay longer can do so if they can demonstrate that they have extenuating circumstances, as reported by Fox 5 New York. These exceptions include if the person has signed a lease for an apartment, has a serious medical procedure, has an immigration hearing scheduled, or proof that they are making efforts to leave the shelter system. Those who cannot showcase any of these extenuating circumstances will be forced to leave the shelters. As these new rules are phased in, they will eventually cover all 15,000 adult migrants that the city is paying to house in an array of hotels, tent dormitories, and other buildings under the city's right to shelter mandate. As the news continues to spread about the new policy, Mayor Eric Adams has hopes that this will kick migrants into gear, forcing them to seek other housing arrangements before they are kicked out of the shelters. This will then, in turn, decrease the number of migrants in shelters, which sits at around 65,000 as of June 2024. Ann Williams-Isom, the deputy mayor leading the city's migrant response, spoke about the city's plan, saying, "We are trying to exit people out of the system so that we can have some stability and then set up something that is more permanent." However, many New Yorkers are now fearful of the negative effects this can have, as those who cannot find other arrangements will likely be forced onto the streets. Will New York City's homelessness issues get worse? According to Coalition for the Homeless, in recent years, the rate of homelessness in New York City has risen to its highest point since the 1930s Great Depression. They also noted how in April 2024, 147,518 people slept each night in New York City's shelters, thousands more slept unsheltered in public spaces, and over 200,000 people slept temporarily doubled up in the homes of others. Legal aids for the city have grown increasingly concerned that new migrant policy will make these matters worse. According to Fox 5 New York, out of the first wave of 250 migrants who faced eviction from the shelters, nearly 200 applied for an extension, and out of those, a little more than half received it. Which poses the question, where did the migrants who were denied end up? Well, one thing is for sure. They did not end up in housing, something that city limits can attest to, stating that there simply isn't enough affordable housing to go around in New York City. Despite Mayor Adams's chief of staff, Camille Joseph Varlak, insisting that these individuals are being connected to resources and being guided through the next steps, and some being re-ticketed to other cities, Legal Aid Society member Catherine Cliff states that it will soon be very obvious if this system fails, undoubtedly leading to an influx in homelessness. How can New York City avoid an increase in homelessness following the new policy? It is unlikely that Mayor Eric Adams is intentionally seeking to create one problem by solving another, as his administration aims to address the pressing issue of migrant homelessness. As the city implements its new policy, a crucial concern is, of course, how to prevent migrants from ending up on the streets once they are evicted from the shelters. To mitigate this risk, New York City could explore alternative solutions such as providing temporary housing or social services like job training and mental health support to help migrants transition into more stable living arrangements. Additionally, the city could collaborate with local organizations and nonprofits to identify and provide assistance to migrants who are most vulnerable to homelessness. By taking a proactive and comprehensive approach, New York City can ensure that its efforts to address migrant homelessness do not inadvertently create a new crisis. Another potential solution could be to work with the federal government to send migrants back to their home countries. This approach would not only address the immediate problem of providing shelter for those who are being evicted, but it would also help reduce the overall number of migrants in New York City. By facilitating the return of migrants to their home countries, the city would be able to alleviate the burden on its resources and infrastructure. Yet, this solution would require federal approval and cooperation, as the federal government has jurisdiction over immigration and border control. If successful, this approach could help to create a more sustainable and effective solution for addressing the issue of migrant homelessness in New York City. However, it seems that so far, the only option given to those evicted has been to be re-ticketed to another city, as mentioned. To add even more concern to the matter, Mayor Eric Adams previously asked a New York Supreme Court justice to allow New York City to ignore the state's long-standing right to shelter law in certain circumstances, which many have argued demonstrates his lack of desire to help migrants. In response to Adams's email, Robert Hayes, who runs the Community Health Network operating 14 centers in New York City, predicted, "Without right to shelter, we'll have encampments, police actions tearing down encampments which will sprout up around the corner, the subways filled with thousands of people. The quality of life for all New Yorkers, not just those who are homeless, will go to hell in a handbasket." Although this may seem like a separate issue, many are fearful that Hayes' concerns could still come to fruition following the new migrant policy that has come into place in 2024. What will New York City look like in the coming months? By now, it is clear that the new migrant shelter eviction policy in New York is expected to relieve the strain on the city's shelter system. However, it's unclear whether this policy will have a significant impact on the overall situation, given that new migrants are still arriving daily. As more and more migrants are forced out onto the streets, concerns are growing about the potential consequences for public safety and the community at large. Without adequate housing or support services, many migrants may be forced to resort to desperate measures to make ends meet and feed themselves, which could lead to an increase in crime and other social problems. This could include petty theft, prostitution, and other forms of survival that can have devastating consequences for individuals and communities alike. According to the New York City criminal justice system, people experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity report histories of arrest and incarceration more often than the general public, as they are more likely to be arrested for a variety of survival offenses. Also, sleeping or camping in public spaces is a crime in New York City. So, as some of these migrants are forced out onto the streets, it is inevitable that many of them will be arrested, thus adding strain on the police force and court system. What about how many criminals are arrested at the border?